Brace yourselves for a journey into the deep heart of one of America's most monumental literary tragedies, a swirling saga of ambition, betrayal, forbidden love, and the unforgiving weight of history. With the precision of a master craftsman and the stormy thunder of biblical forewarning, William Faulkner conjures a world both majestic and doomed, a world that refuses to let its characters, or its readers, escape unscathed. This is Absalom, a novel that stands as both a testament to and a condemnation of the illusions that once forged and destroyed an entire generation in the Old South. Prepare to be transported to Yoknapatawpha County, Mississippi, where one man's grand design tests the boundaries of morality, race, and legacy. We will cross thresholds into shadowy halls, glimpse battles waged in the fiery crucible of the Civil War, and witness the unstoppable collapse of a proud empire built on secrets and a desperate lust for social transcendence. In this sweeping epic retelling, we follow the life and legacy of Thomas Sutpen, a haunted figure whose iron will collide with the brutal realities of class, race, and family scandal. By the end, the colossal pillars of Sutpen's 100 will lie in smoldering ruins, leaving us to reckon with the ashes of dream and destiny. Gather your courage and your curiosity. The story of Absalom awaits, pulling us into its labyrinth of guilt, heritage, and the tragedy that can arise when a single man's obsessive ambition dares to challenge both God and society. Absalom is anchored in Faulkner's fictional Yoknapatawpha County, Mississippi, stretching across time from before the Civil War into the early 20th century. At its center stands the mighty but accursed Sutpen family, whose patriarch, Thomas Sutpen, erects a grand plantation home called Sutpen's 100. Faulkner's tapestry weaves themes of slavery, heritage, and the heavy burden of Southern aristocratic pride, all culminating in a searing tragedy. Although Faulkner originally presents the narrative through multiple narrators in a fragmented, non-chronological structure, we will lay out this spoiler-inclusive summary in a clearer, chronological flow to help you fully absorb every dramatic turn. It is a story as deeply rooted in biblical overtones as it is in the tangible soil of the American South. The title Absalom references the biblical story of King David's son who rebelled and was ultimately destroyed, an ominous prelude to the Sutpen family's fate. Thomas Sutpen's beginnings are shrouded in rural poverty in the early 19th century. Growing up in the backcountry, he experiences a defining moment of humiliation that alters the course of his life. Turned away by a black servant from a wealthy man's front door, he realizes that social standing, anchored by land, enslavement, and power, is the key to being treated with respect. From that day forward, he obsessively devotes himself to a grand design, to acquire wealth, status, and a legitimate lineage that no one can deny. Drifting to the West Indies, likely Haiti, as a young man, he amasses a mysterious fortune and marries a local woman. After fathering a child with her, he makes a horrifying discovery. She has partial black ancestry. According to the racist logic of his era, Thomas Sutpen believes this disqualifies her from being part of his pure Southern lineage. He brutally discards both wife and child, committing an act that will cast a long shadow over the rest of his life. His rejection of his first family becomes the catalyst of a secret that dooms his ambitious enterprise. In 1833, with gold obtained in the Caribbean, Sutpen purchases 100 square miles of land in Jefferson, Mississippi, and christens it Sutpen's 100. The locals watch warily as he brings in enslaved people, some from the West Indies, speaking French or Creole dialects, to raise a massive plantation house. Murmurs about his fortune and his background persist, but Sutpen's sheer force of character garners a mixture of fascination, fear, and begrudging respect. To cement his standing among Jefferson's white gentry, Sutpen courts and marries Ellen Coldfield, daughter of a respected local merchant. For Ellen, the marriage promises security and status. For Sutpen, it is the next critical step in his design, establishing a socially unquestionable heritage. Together, they have 2 children, Henry and Judith. The grand house at Sutpen's 100 may remain unfinished in various ways, but Sutpen is laser-focused on his heirs, determined that they embody the refinement and social distinction he so fiercely craves. Henry Sutpen is born around 1839, followed a few years later by Judith. Raised in an imposing estate, they experience a life of privilege sustained by their father's wealth and reputation, though the community keeps its distance from the imperious and enigmatic Thomas Sutpen. Henry eventually leaves for the University of Mississippi, where Sutpen hopes he will cultivate the manners and connections befitting a future gentleman of the South. Judith, meanwhile, grows into a poised and strong-willed young woman, bearing traits of both her mother's gentleness and her father's stoicism. The story's central conflict arrives when Henry, at university, bonds with a new friend, Charles Bond, a dashing and cosmopolitan young man from New Orleans. So enamored is Henry with Charles's sophistication that he brings him home to Sutpen's 100, ensuring that Charles meets Judith. Little do any of them know that this fateful friendship will set off a tragic chain of revelations and violence. Charles Bond possesses charm, elegance, and an air of mystery. His Creole background, hinted to include some French lineage, fascinates Henry. Soon enough, Charles and Judith form a romantic connection, and an engagement looms, much to Thomas Sutpen's alarm. The reason is something Henry initially does not know. Charles Bond is actually Sutpen's son from that first marriage in the West Indies. Sutpen's horror stems from both the racial taboo. Charles Bond may have non-white ancestry, and from the incestuous possibility that Judith is unwittingly about to marry her half-brother. Instead of explaining these terrible truths outright, Sutpen attempts to manipulate Henry, fueling the young man's resentment. Unable to comprehend his father's urgency, and suspecting it might be a matter of petty prejudice or class snobbery, Henry sides with Charles Bond. In a dramatic act of rebellion, Henry renounces his inheritance and flees Sutpen's 100 with Charles, determined to break free from his father's control. As Henry and Charles stand on the brink of scandal and rebellion, the Civil War erupts. This massive conflict momentarily eclipses personal drama as Henry and Charles enlist in the Confederate Army. For 4 years, they fight side by side, forging a deeper bond on the battlefields of the South. Back at home, Judith awaits Charles's return, anticipating their future marriage. Thomas Sutpen, too, serves in the Confederate war effort. By the end of the war, the South is in ruins, a devastation that mirrors the moral decay within the Sutpen family. At some point, Henry discovers the truth about Charles Bond's parentage and the rumors of his mixed-race heritage. Torn between love for his best friend, the horror of incest, and the racially charged codes of the time, Henry wrestles with a choice he never dreamed he would have to make. When the Civil War concludes, Charles Bond travels to Sutpen's 100 to claim Judith as his bride. Henry, now fully aware of Charles's identity, confronts him at the plantation's gates. Believing that the taboo of incest and the shame of a possible mixed-race marriage cannot be allowed to unfold, Henry takes matters into his own hands. In a moment loaded with betrayal, sorrow, and hopeless resignation, Henry shoots Charles Bond dead. The impact of this murder is cataclysmic. Henry vanishes, leaving behind a broken engagement, a heartbroken sister, and a father whose meticulously crafted legacy is in shards. Judith is robbed of her fiancé. Ellen Coldfield soon dies, and Sutpen is left to grapple with the ruinous consequences of his secret history. Ellen's sister, Rosa Coldfield, emerges as a major voice of anger and disillusionment. She harbors a simmering hatred for Thomas Sutpen and the havoc he has unleashed on her family. When Ellen dies, Miss Rosa is pulled back into Sutpen's orbit in a grotesque twist. Sutpen proposes to her, implying that if she can produce a male heir, only then will he formalize their marriage. Repulsed by this cold-blooded proposition, Rosa flees Sutpen's 100, vowing never again to be ensnared by his manipulations. She nurses her bitterness for decades, ultimately enlisting young Quentin Compson to help her uncover or confront whatever secrets remain in the decaying mansion. Rosa's perspective, brimming with Gothic accusation and personal vendetta, filters much of the narrative we receive, even as Faulkner intersperses other viewpoints. The bulk of Absalom comes to us through layers of storytelling long after the events have passed. Quentin Compson, also known from Faulkner's The Sound and The Fury, is a college-bound young man in the early 1900s hailing from Jefferson. Before leaving for Harvard, he is summoned by the elderly Miss Rosa Coldfield to hear the Sutpen story from her perspective. Later, Quentin pieces together additional accounts from his father, Mr. Compson, who provides a more detached, historical viewpoint. At Harvard, Quentin and his Canadian roommate Shreve spend long nights reconstructing the Sutpen saga from the fragments they have, filling in gaps with speculation, rumor, and imaginative leaps. Their retelling draws us deeper into the mystery and tragedy of Sutpen's 100. Quentin's own emotional entanglement with the South's history underscores a key theme: the weight of collective guilt and the inescapable pull of ancestral sins. Once the Civil War and Bond's murder have shattered his aspirations, Sutpen returns to a ravaged Jefferson. Sutpen's 100 is a skeleton of its former glory, with a post-war economy in tatters. Despite everything, Sutpen makes one last attempt to secure a male heir, this time turning to Millie, the granddaughter of Wash Jones, a ragged squatter who had been fiercely loyal to him. Sutpen's hopes rest on Millie giving birth to a boy. Tragically for Millie, she delivers a girl, prompting Sutpen to react with dismissive anger. Infuriated by Sutpen's cruelty toward his granddaughter, Wash Jones takes violent revenge, killing Sutpen with a scythe. The patriarch's life ends in a moment of gruesome reckoning, fulfilling the biblical sense of doom forecast by the novel's title. With Thomas Sutpen dead, Judith struggles to maintain the fading remnants of Sutpen's 100 alongside Clytie, a woman born into slavery who is believed to be Sutpen's daughter by an enslaved woman. Clytie remains loyal and protective, even as the mansion decays. Judith tries to salvage something noble from the wreckage. She takes in Charles Etienne de St. Valery Bond, the child of Charles Bond and an unknown woman of mixed race in New Orleans. The boy grows up under the gloom of Sutpen's 100, haunted by the knowledge of his father's fate. Time passes. Charles Etienne eventually marries a woman of partial black ancestry, incurring the vicious disapproval of Jefferson's racist society. They have a child, Jim Bond, a boy of even darker features who becomes the final living link to the Sutpen line. Judith herself succumbs to illness, dying quietly while Clytie stands guard over the mansion's lonely corridors. Suddenly, Henry reappears, decades after shooting Charles Bond, slipping back into Sutpen's 100 in secret. Racked by guilt and fear, he hides in an upstairs room, barely surviving under Clytie's care. Miss Rosa hears rumors of his return and, fueled by a mix of righteousness and lingering anger, persuades Quentin Compson to accompany her to the house. Their discovery of Henry alive in a darkened room ignites the novel's final conflagration. As Rosa rushes off to find a doctor, Clytie, terrified that exposing Henry to the authorities or the outside world would bring a final, humiliating end, sets the house on fire. Flames consume the once great mansion. Clytie and Henry perish together in the blaze, sealing the fate of Thomas Sutpen's design in a furious conflagration. Jim Bond, Charles Etienne's son and Sutpen's last known descendant, escapes, howling and roaming the countryside. In the aftermath, the mansion's ashes become a dark symbol of all that Sutpen tried to control and all that ultimately escaped his grasp. His quest to create a perfect Southern dynasty ends in tragedy, leaving behind only a traumatized survivor and the ghostly echoes of a dream turned nightmare. Faulkner's novel illuminates several powerful themes. Burden of the past. The Sutpen family tragedy reveals how historical sins, slavery, racism, pride cast long shadows. Quentin, an outsider to the Sutpen line, nonetheless becomes captive to its haunting grip. Racial identity and miscegenation. Charles Bond's mixed heritage is the fulcrum upon which Sutpen's design teeters. Faulkner tackles the deeply ingrained racial hierarchies of the Old South, exposing the absurd and tragic consequences of obsessively maintaining purity. Obsessive ambition and hubris. Sutpen's unyielding vision of social ascension leads him to discard his moral compass. His downfall is a stark warning about the corrupting power of unwavering ambition. Incest and taboo. In The Near Marriage of Charles Bond and Judith, Faulkner accentuates how secrecy poisons family bonds. Henry's eventual murder of Charles is both an act of twisted moral rescue and a tragic betrayal of brotherly love. The Fall of the Old South. Sutpen's 100 stands as a microcosm of the antebellum South, built on enslaved labor and racial oppression. The Civil War ravages the empire, and its final destruction by fire symbolizes the collapse of an entire way of life. Character portraits in depth. Thomas Sutpen, a figure of immense willpower, consumed by the dream of founding a legacy that erases his impoverished past. His cruelty, discarding his first wife and son, manipulating potential heirs, and controlling his children's destinies, ensures that he will ultimately reap what he has sown. Henry Sutpen, torn between familial loyalty and moral horror. Henry's life collapses when he learns Charles Bond is both his half-brother and of partial black ancestry. Henry's final act, murdering Bond, exiles him from humanity itself, condemning him to a spectral existence until he perishes in the final conflagration. Judith Sutpen, a steadfast, quietly resolute woman forced to watch her father's ambitions destroy her closest relationships. She radiates dignity and compassion, as evidenced by her caring for Charles Etienne, but her own fate is sealed by Sutpen's legacy. Charles Bond, the charismatic, secret heir to Sutpen, raised in New Orleans. His refined manners and mysterious background captivate Henry and Judith. Charles's very existence embodies the South's darkest taboos of race and incest, and his presence triggers the cataclysmic events of the novel. Miss Rosa Coldfield. Driven by bitterness toward Sutpen, Rosa's narrative drips with Gothic fury and personal vendetta. She draws Quentin Compson into the tale, seeking a vindication or resolution she herself cannot fully articulate. Clitty. Often overlooked in superficial readings, Clitty is Sutpen's enslaved daughter, and later his household servant. Her devotion to the mansion and to Henry in his final days reveals a tragic nobility. In the end, she would rather burn everything than let outside forces tear the last shreds of the family apart. Quentin Compson. Though not a Sutpen himself, Quentin inherits the psychological burden of this story. He becomes the vessel through which Faulkner examines how the Old South's ghosts haunt the modern era. Faulkner's Mississippi resonates with decaying pillars of aristocracy, grand mansions rotting from within, humidity so thick it stifles logic, and a community's unspoken acceptance of racial injustice. Before the Civil War, Thomas Sutpen's empire stands as a testament to how illusions of gentility and superiority can mask sinister realities. The war's aftermath leaves the South ravaged, dethroning men like Sutpen who built fortunes on coerced labor and rigid social codes. Faulkner heightens the Gothic atmosphere with images of darkened hallways, flickering candles, and a final, all-consuming fire. This blend of historical realism and almost supernatural dread communicates that the past never truly fades. It lingers and festers in the memory of those who remain. While we've laid out the events chronologically for clarity, Faulkner himself presents them through a kaleidoscope of narrators. Miss Rosa's indignant recollections, Mr. Compson's more philosophical stance, Quentin's haunted wonder, and Shreve's outsider curiosity. Each new lens adds competing details, bridging gaps with conjecture and rumor. This mosaic approach reinforces a key theme. History is mutable, shaped as much by interpretation as by objective fact. Did Henry fully grasp Charles Bond's racial background prior to the murder? Could Sutpen have saved his family if he'd told the truth earlier? These questions linger, blurred by the subjectivity of each retelling. In Faulkner's hands, the truth is an elusive tapestry, yet all versions point to the same inevitable tragedy. Beneath the novel's labyrinthine structure lies an emotional epicenter of grief and guilt. Sutpen's ambition warps every relationship around him, turning children into pawns and lovers into obstacles. Henry's betrayal of Charles stems from a desperate bid to prevent incest and social condemnation, but it destroys both men's lives. Judith's quiet endurance testifies to the collateral damage that such a design inflicts on innocent bystanders. Miss Rosa's bitterness underscores how deeply Sutpen's manipulations corrode entire families across generations. Even Quentin, who learns of the Sutpen saga decades later, finds himself unable to escape its resonance. Faulkner masterfully uses Quentin's perspective to illustrate that the tragedies of the past are not dead, but remain unsettling forces in the collective memory. The haunting climax occurs when Miss Rosa, determined to expose or redeem the last Sutpen heir, drags Quentin Compson to Sutpen's 100. They find Henry, frail and close to death, hidden upstairs by Clitty. Attempting to bring medical help, Rosa unknowingly triggers Clitty's desperate act, setting the mansion on fire to protect Henry from the justice or condemnation of the outside world. In the roaring flames, Henry and Cludy meet their end. Their deaths cap the Sutpen saga with apocalyptic finality, as if the mansion itself, once a monument to grand ambition, will not suffer to stand any longer. That Jim Bond remains alive, an orphan of uncertain lineage, emotionally unmoored, speaks to the residue of history's sins. He howls in the darkness, symbolizing the final, uncontainable legacy of Sutpen's illusions. Absalom sits among Faulkner's most intricate works, richly layered with narrative complexity and a fearless depiction of race, power, and identity in the South. Rather than offering a neat moral, Faulkner underscores how ambition rooted in cruelty breeds ruin for all. Sutpen's tragic flaw, his refusal to accept any chink in the armor of his idealized empire, points to the larger hypocrisy of a society built on the subjugation of human beings. Each retelling stirs up questions about complicity and memory. How does one live with the knowledge of a rotted foundation? Faulkner's answer seems to be that such knowledge will inevitably resurface, often in violent or haunting ways. By exposing the twisted genealogies and repressed truths behind Sutpen's 100, Faulkner confronts the deeper American struggle with race, legacy, and the illusions of grandeur. The novel's abiding power lies in its psychological intensity. The simmering tension between father and sons, the painful love between siblings, the simmering resentments of women who have been used as pawns, all are rendered with a mythic weight. When Henry raises his pistol against Charles Bond, readers feel not just the shock of a personal betrayal, but the dark gravity of a society determined to uphold its most rigid taboos. As time marches on, Quentin Compson's obsession with the Sutpen story mirrors our own collective grappling with history. Faulkner forces us to ask, are we doomed to repeat the sins we refuse to acknowledge? Is an honest reckoning with the past the only path to any semblance of progress? The novel's final image, Jim Bond wandering aimlessly, remains a chilling reminder of the human cost of bigotry, secrecy, and unbridled ambition. By weaving themes of incest, race, pride, and betrayal into a story that spans decades, Faulkner cements Absalom as a cornerstone of American literature. It is at once a macabre family saga and a fierce indictment of the cultural underpinnings of the Old South. Through multiple narrators, Faulkner peels back layers of time and perception, forcing us to reconcile contradictory versions of events, a method that mirrors the deeply human process of remembering and misremembering the past. Despite its grandeur, Absalom is also an intensely intimate story about individuals devoured by obsessions they cannot control. Thomas Sutpen's design is not just a dream of a perfect plantation family. It is a reckless defiance of both moral and societal constraints that eventually blows back with the fury of a biblical plague. The conflagration that ends the novel signifies the cataclysmic downfall of every false premise upon which Sutpen built his life. And so the fate of Sutpen's 100 is sealed in a raging inferno, a final judgment on the lies, betrayals, and blind ambitions that shaped its walls. What began with one man's humiliating revelation and fierce thirst for power culminates in the total annihilation of everything he sought to forge: his house, his heirs, and even the twisted illusions of purity he tried to enshrine. As the flames devour Sutpen's empire, they cast long shadows that stretch far beyond Mississippi, reminding us that no dream built on deceit and oppression can endure unscathed. From the dying breath of Thomas Sutpen to the anguished cries of Jim Bond, This story reverberates with the resounding echoes of guilt, heritage, and the relentless pursuit of an unattainable ideal. Through Quentin Compson's eyes, we witness the torch of history passed forward, burdening the next generation with questions about accountability and the cost of denying our own legacies. Absalom endures as one of William Faulkner's greatest achievements, burning bright with cautionary power. A timeless epic reminding us that the embers of the past must be reckoned with or risk igniting anew.